Hello and welcome to the 27th Annual Get Lit Festival. I'm Kate Peterson, Director of Get Lit Programs, a nonprofit organization housed within Eastern Washington University. Our program is responsible for Get Lit, Washington State's longest-running annual literary festival, which hosts dozens of free and low-cost readings, craft classes, panel discussions, and many more exciting literary events. This year's headlining authors are Maggie Smith, Li-Young Lee, and Danez Smith. We're thrilled to be hosting in-person events featuring those headliners alongside over 60 talented writers from our region and beyond, well beyond when it comes to today's event. The festival takes place this Thursday through Sunday, April 10th through the 13th in many venues across downtown Spokane, Cheney, and even Coeur d'Alene. And we're excited to be presenting 8 virtual events here on YouTube this year. You can find our full schedule along with information about all of our festival authors by visiting our website, getlitfestival.org. Now I'd like to welcome Mackenzie Draper, Get Lit's Assistant Coordinator, who will introduce today's event.
Welcome, everyone. We're excited to present authors Ashley Hay, Sulari Gentle, James Bradley, Anne-Marie Tifew, Kira Geddes, Laura Jean McKay, and Melanie Chang in this event, Creativity Down Under, a reading and conversation with Australian writers. Join 7 talented Australian writers who will read excerpts of their work from a wide range of genres, including historical fiction, crime fiction, ecological fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. They'll kick off our event by reading a section from their works.
Our first reader today is Ashley Hay. Ashley is the internationally acclaimed author of the novels The Body in the Clouds and The Railwayman's Wife, which was honored with the Colin Roderick Award by the Foundation for Australian Literary Studies and longlisted for the Miles Franklin Literary Award, the most prestigious literary prize in Australia, among other numerous accolades. She has also written 4 nonfiction books, most recently Gum, the story of eucalypts and their champions. She lives in Brisbane, Australia. Please welcome Ashley.
Thanks so much for having me in your part of the world. I'm talking to you from Brisbane, which is the unceded lands of the Yagara and the Turrbal people. And I'm going to read from 100 Small Lessons, which is my most recent novel. It was early on a winter's morning when she fell, the shortest day of 2010, the woman on the radio said. From where Elsie lay, quite still and curled comfortably on the thick green carpet between the sofa and the sideboard, she could see how the sun coming in through the back door made a triangle on the kitchen floor. The light caught the pattern on the lino and touched the little nests of dust that her broom had missed under the lip of the kitchen cupboards. The bright triangle changed as the minutes passed, disappearing from the kitchen to pop up first in the back bedroom, then across the busy pattern of Nile green and white tiles in the bathroom. Later, in her own bedroom, it reached almost all the way across the floor to the thick rose-coloured chenille of her bedspread, before it swung around further towards the west in search of the sunroom. The pile of the carpet, from where she lay, looked like neatly sheared blades of grass, the tidy job of mowing that Clem would have done. There was something comforting about being this close to the topography of the house. She knew this place so well. She wasn't sure if it was an extension of her or she of it. So this was a new kind of exploration, noticing the way the floor sloped a little into the spare room and how the beading sagged slightly on one segment of the ceiling. Topography, she counted through the letters, 10. Geography, landscape. The answer to 14 down in that morning's crossword where she'd been trying to make projection fit. She was losing her touch. From outside, she could hear the kookaburra. He'd be looking for his food. You could set your watch by him, she thought. There were cars on the road, the squeak of the swing in the park, the rich buzz of aeroplanes climbing up from the airport, the chatter of lorikeets, corellas. All that activity. It was nice to lie still among it, although the kookaburra would be disappointed she'd put nothing out today. And then the house muttered a little too, its boards creaking and stretching as the day warmed. It was a consoling sound. They'd had a long chat, Elsie Gormley, in this house, more than 60 years of it. It had witnessed all her tempers, all her moods, and usually improved them. It held her voice, her husband's, her children's, and now their children's in turn. Echoes and repetitions lodged in around the skirting boards, around the window frames like those pale motes of dust that had wedged at the edge of the kitchen floor. Reverb, one of Don's young boys had told her. Don's own grandson, she supposed, her great-grandson then, the one with the noisy guitar. Imagine it like this, Nan, layers of echoes arranged to make it sound like you're in a great big space. Well, reverb, she thought clearly. A nice word. She liked to keep abreast of what they knew, how they lived, their magic gadgets, their shiny new phones. Like this, Nan, one swipe and it turns on. She swiped her fingers now against the thick green carpet. Yes, she could almost hear it. All those voices, all those years. It was lunchtime and then afternoon, and as the sun sank lower, she wondered how cold it might get there on the floor overnight. She was 89 years old and her bones were brittle and tired. The neighbours came then, one to the front door, one to the back. Elsie, they called, are you there, love? Are you right? I'm not here, she said, and lay still, wondering if she could turn her head far enough to see the fiery clouds of the sunset through the windows at the front of the house.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Our second reader is Sulari Gentle. Sulari is the author of the multi-award-winning Roland Sinclair Mysteries, a series of 10 historical crime novels set in 1930s Australia. Her widely praised standalone novel, After She Wrote Him, won the Ned Kelly Award for Best Crime Novel and was shortlisted for the Davitt Award. Most recently, she published the award-winning and USA Today best-selling The Woman in the Library. Sulari lives in a small country town in the Australian Snowy Mountains where she grows French black truffles and writes. She remains in love with the art of storytelling. Please welcome Sulari.
Hello, am I unmuted? Yes. Thank you very much for having me. I come to you from the lands of the Wiradjuri people in the Snowy Mountains of New South Wales. And I'm going to read to you from The Mystery Writer, which is my most recently published book. And I'll begin with the prologue. He awoke early on the day he died, lying unmoving for a time under the weight of frustration, the inertia of despair. The grief was crushing, the realization that he'd lost it all over something that should have been nothing. He sat up. The bookcase was blurred, and though he tried to pull himself together, it remained so. Slowly, stiffly, he rose from the couch on which he'd spent the night and grabbed a book from the middle shelf. His first novel, Once Everything, the culmination of dreams, an admission ticket to it all, until she'd torn it down. He ran his fingertips over the glossy jacket. The letters of his name were slightly raised. He'd never see that again, never feel it. Hit the road, Jack. The tune was harsh on his lips, self-mocking and bitter. A suit had been laid out for him. Shirt, shoes, even boxes. Every last thing had been considered, every outcome anticipated, every decision already made. There was nothing left to do but die. Chapter 1. Theodosia Benton stood on her big brother Gus's doorstep, pausing to enjoy the relief of a long journey's end. But the breath she let out was snatched back as bedlam exploded onto the porch in the form of a massive hellhound of some sort. Though not as a rule frightened of dogs, Theo was unsure of her welcome and tired and still a little overwhelmed by the enormity of what she had done. And so she disintegrated a little, pounding on the door in tears and panic as the dog tried to raise the dead. A few neighbours poked their heads out to investigate what was apparently a murder in progress. Gus Benton had been entertaining. After a few minutes of scrabbling for clothes, he opened the door. "Theo, what the hell?" He stared at her. Theo tried to make herself heard, but it was futile. The dog was relentless, determined to alert the entire block that there was someone on the threshold. She placed her hands over her ears, cringing away from the din. Gus broke off to calm his dog, and eventually he managed to persuade it to stop barking. The comparative silence that followed provided an opportunity to explain. But now everything Theo had practiced on the flights and bus trips that had brought her from Sydney to Lawrence in the sunflower state of Kansas was lost to her. She stuttered apologies for not having told him she was coming. "Come on," Gus grabbed her bags and motioned her to follow him inside, where he introduced Pam, the young lady wearing his shirt and little else. Pam didn't stay long. A distressed girl with luggage, even if she was just a sister, was probably less than romantic. When they were alone, Gus asked again, "What are you doing here, Theo? Do Mum and Dad know? What the hell is going on?" And so she told him what she'd done. "What do you mean you left uni?" he asked. "You've only got another couple of years to graduation. Surely it can't be that bad." "It is." "But you always wanted to be an attorney." Theo smiled faintly. "Solicitor," she said. He'd become such an American. "Gus, I was 18 when I enrolled in law school. I'm not sure I even knew what a lawyer really was. I just wanted to be like you, to do what you were doing, so that you'd..." She shook her head. Gus exhaled. "Okay, I get it. But there are tons of people in Australia who aren't lawyers. What are you doing here?" I thought..." She told him about the creative writing classes she'd taken, the story she wanted to write. The words stumbled out, a confession. Her increasing disinterest in the law, the ever-growing sense of panic and loneliness, and the feeling that she just couldn't face another day, another lecture, until all she could do was run. And then Theo made herself stop talking, knowing that the frantic explanations, the pleading justifications made her sound quite mad, and she needed Gus to believe that she was at least sane. She bit her lip to stop herself from filling the silence with words. For a moment, he said nothing, simply looking at her as if he were trying to decide if she was really herself. And then he groaned. "Bloody hell, Theo, you could just have said this on the phone, and I would have picked you up at Fort Worth." Thank you.
Thank you, Solari. Our next reader is James Bradley. James is an Australian writer and critic. His books include the novels Rack, The Deep Field, The Resurrectionist, Clade, and Ghost Species, a book of poetry, Paper Nautilus, and a work of nonfiction, Deep Water, The World in the Ocean. His new novel, Landfall, will be published this April. He lives in Sydney. Please welcome James.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm in the inner west of Sydney on the lands of the Gadigal people. I'm reading today from Deep Water, my most recent book, which is a book about the ocean. And I'm going to read a little bit from the end of the chapter about swimming, in which I talk about the nature of swimming, the history of swimming, the deeply racialized nature of the history of swimming. The ocean is not trackless or unknowable. Instead, as I'm reminded every time I enter its waters, it is a living space, where the great cycles of the planet, the movement of the tides and currents, the motion of the cloud, the arrival and disappearance of animals across days and seasons, intertwine with the busy life of the immediate, the suck and pull of the kelp in the surge of the waves, the shimmering movement of the fish, the cries of the gulls and the dive-bombing terns. Understood in this way, water's mutability becomes a way of imagining and even inhabiting different ways of being, of acknowledging the intermingling of our bodies and lives with both planetary systems and the intimate microscopic life that surrounds and permeates us. Perhaps it would do better to attend to the experience itself, the way that surrendering to the weightless embrace of the water allows us to be in our bodies in the most intimate way, while also connected to these larger cycles. Understood like this, swimming is more than a way of being. It is a way of knowing. When we swim, we become one with water's fluidity. Suspended in it, we must learn to follow its eddies and currents, to allow its motion to bear us where we want to go. As anybody who swims in surf will know, it is not possible to fight the waves. Instead, it is necessary to move with them. Sometimes that is exhilarating. Sometimes it is meditative. Occasionally it can be terrifying. But it also offers a different way of thinking about our relationship to the world around us. When we swim, our bodies become part of the tidal flow and movement of water, the great pulse of the planet's systems, the act of giving ourselves over to their rhythms, a form of communion, of embodied connectedness. As the Blue Humanities scholar Steve Mentz has eloquently put it, swimming can become an ecological meditation for the Anthropocene. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Our fourth reader is Anne-Marie Tifew. Anne-Marie is an Australian-born Maori who belongs to the Te Rarawa Iwi in Hokianga, Aotearoa, New Zealand. She is a poet, editor, and weaver. She was a 2021 Next Chapter Fellowship recipient, and her writing has been published nationally and internationally, including Another Australia, Te Awa o Kupu, Sport, Tuparanga Journal, Inter-Island Collective, SBS Voices, Cordite, Contemporary Hum, Ora Nui Journal, Te Whē, Caldor Public Art Projects, Awa Wahine, and Australian Poetry Journal. Please welcome Anne-Marie.
Kia ora tātou. It's an honour to be beaming in with you in this Zoom room from the unceded Wongal lands. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. These first two pieces are really for anyone that has siblings who have mental illness. Blood brothers. I recite a karakia for my brothers. They would prefer I bring kebabs. I tell them about the hokianga, and they tell me about their bills. I explain tangata whenua, and they turn the TV up. I dream of Tane Mahuta, and they roll a cigarette. I summon the names of our ancestors. They take their medication. I miss our marae. They put the bins out. And this next one's called Hoodie. A brief visit is best. I plan my departure upon arrival. 4 flights of stairs lead to their place. It's a reinvented 6-pack apartment block. They hear my footsteps and preempt my knock. Front door, heavily locked, freed by clean, cut keys. Fly screen flicked to release, held open by pressure pump. My youngest brother greets me, his swollen stomach and unshaven grin. It's shoes off and socks on. Family photos hung from when we once were. 100 DVDs stick tightly together on bookshelf. Mum and Dad's ashes take pride of place. A pyramid of pre-rolled cigarettes waits patiently. My other brother remains seated, holding remote. What have you got on under that hoodie? He's propped up by the only softness he knows now. The crevices of leather lounge he sinks into. His tongue is loose with weapons, counting cars, switching channels, clicking dials. I ask him how he's doing and what he's been up to. He tells me the smoke alarm batteries need to be changed. I pull back a heavy light-out curtain, hoping to find the sun, but instead, blinds. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Our next reader is Kira Geddes. Born in Adelaide as the daughter of German immigrants, Kira spent her infancy in the South Australian opal fields before moving to Sydney. Following a successful career in marketing, Kira returned to university to study English and pursue her lifelong dream of writing, publishing 2 short stories and earning the Vice Chancellor's Award for Academic Excellence. The Story Thief is her debut novel and the culmination of almost a decade of research and writing. When not at her desk, Kira can often be found visiting one of Sydney's many art galleries or daydreaming about future travel with her husband and 2 children. Please welcome Kira.
Thank you very much, Kate. It's a pleasure to be here from Sydney on the lands of the Darramuggle people. Before I begin my reading, I hope it's okay. I just want to situate it slightly in the novel, just because it'll make more context, provide a better context. So my novel, The Story Thief, it's a historical novel, and it is a feminist retelling of a very famous Australian short story called The Drover's Wife, which is written by Henry Lawson in 1892, who, believe it or not, he's actually taught in universities all around the world, including America. So this is a retelling of his story. And in my novel, I won't go into too much detail, but where I'm going to set where this scene is set, it's September 1922, at the actual historic occasion of Henry Lawson's state funeral in Waverley Cemetery in Sydney. So obviously it's a fiction, but I just wanted to let people know where we are because it'll make more sense. All right, time to lay him to rest, literally. So instead of joining the foreseeable mass of spectators in the city, where I would likely be relegated to standing outside St Andrew's Cathedral for the duration of the service, I opted to go straight to Waverley Cemetery to await the procession from there. Along the way, I passed scores of waiting children on the side of the road. I paused at the spiked metal entrance gate, suddenly wary of crossing its threshold. Yet save for the huddled presence of a few nervous-looking groundskeepers, the cemetery was remarkably quiet. I was early. I wandered down through the vast grounds until all I could see was the dark mirrored sweep of the Pacific Ocean before me and the Norfolk Island pines bordering either side. With sea and land conspiring to enclose this space, the cemetery formed its own townscape, complete with roads, paths, and a smattering of minor buildings. A town for the dead. The sky itself was attired for this nationwide day of mourning. Heavy black clouds had drawn across it, threatening to burst at any moment. Only the cool white of Italian Carrara marble stood out against the darkness. Strewn across the sloping landscape, soaring pillars and stone-carved angels rose from the earth like ghostly figures. And although the cemetery's cliff-top setting was beautiful, it was almost too beautiful. Must death and the promise of an afterlife always be glorified? I chose a quiet position for myself halfway up the northern ridge and at a discreet distance from the gravesite where a large crowd was slowly gathering. Little by little, the funeral cortege came into view. With mounted police leading the way, the motor hearse entered the cemetery gates, ushered in by the awaiting police band. A string of cars followed, each one disgorging yet another group of somberly dressed mourners who joined the last stragglers arriving on foot. At the sight of Henry Lawson's purple-draped coffin, I felt my breath catch. In an instant, the questions which had been biding their time in the back of my mind all day suddenly thrust themselves before me. What happens to a story after its storyteller has died? What happens to its cast of characters when they are finally set free? I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Kira. Our sixth reader is Laura Jean McKay. Laura is the author of The Animals in That Country, winner of the prestigious Arthur C. Clarke Award, the Victorian Prize for Literature, the ABIA Small Publishers Adult Book of the Year, and co-winner of the Aurealis Award for Best Science Fiction Novel. The Animals in That Country has been shortlisted for the Stella Prize and longlisted for the Miles Franklin Award. The novel is one of the reading's best Australian books of the 21st century. She was awarded the NZSA Waitangi Day Literary Honours in 2022. Her latest collection is Gunflower, shortlisted for the Queensland Literary Awards and named one of the Guardian's best books of 2023. Please welcome Laura.
Hello, thank you, Mackenzie, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, Get Lit, for having me here amongst such an incredible group. It's a little bit intimidating to do a reading after that incredible experience of words. This is a short story from my new collection, Gunflower. I'm just trying to, well, you can get a general sense of the red haze there. And this is a story called 279. It's set in a time when I lived in Aotearoa, in a small country town surrounded by cows. Do they look like cows? I guess so, Con. Shrunken sky cows with wings and blazed chests and beaks. What's a beak? It's a dreamy sort of a question for off times, shovel leaning inside from too much rain. A beak, Con, is what a bird has. What's a bird? I mean, you've said what a bird is. Avio, avian. Avian, all that. But what is a bird? A bird isn't anything, Connie. Connie climbs off the couch to right the handle of a bucket and to haul it, nuggety little thing, across the room. The rain hangs from the ceiling crack like a string of beads and scatters over the floor. Connie would more know a string of beads than a bird. We have beads. I used to see bird carcasses around, but their hollow flying bones are no good for swamping. The floods, what was left of the chickens, those mass graves, has been washed away. She opens the door, crouches and crosses the wet patch, and tips. The water from the bucket sloshes into the water, channeling past the steps of the house. How high is it? I call. What about the cows? She says, the milking shed, and it's up to our first steps. The cows are on the island. She puts the bucket back. The leak in the ceiling now a bony beat on the plastic base. Connie's face when she gets on the couch again. I'll do it, I tell her, from now on. Can you say about the other animals? She asks. It's too upsetting. Come on. I take a breath. There were lizards, reptiles, one as old as anything. She doesn't ask if a lizard looks like a cow, but how else to describe it? Well, you know how our feet get wet when we're unsticking the cows, I say. Barefoot? Wrinkled? Old? She asks. That's a lizard. That's Tuatara. Was, old as anything. Older than, why mention dinosaurs? It's pointless. Older than 279. Bye, 279, says Connie. When the oldest one slipped and fell in the drink, we took off our gumboots and waded in. I wasn't worried for us, the tide wasn't much, and with Connie 8 already and already so sensible, but 279 was embedded and lowing in the sucking mud. The rain stopped for a bit. The cow quietened, looked around, then gathered her haunch muscles and heaved, swinging her forelegs for solid ground. It seemed hopeful. I could almost have joined her without getting trampled. Out of habit, I glanced at the sky, expecting a bird where only clouds flocked. It rained so hard that I did fear for Connie. We withdrew up the hill to the porch. The cow slipped again, went under. Bye, 279, said Connie. But there were nightmares and a kicked over bucket, a refusal to eat the beans that we don't really have enough of to refuse. Next flood, we got the big headphones out and connected her to my phone, and I found a quicker way to deal with it. Now Connie's staring at her feet, a bit pruned, calling them lizards. Why are there cows, she asks. I mean, why only them? Do you love them the most? Outside, one of them calls through the rain. There are no other sounds, lowing and water. What will you play? I ask Connie. Her eyes go blank. What should I? I mean, how loud? The loudest. I wait until the guitar tins through the room. I honestly downloaded that hair metal once as a joke. Second step, don't drop the gun. Toes dipping into water like ducks used to drink. The cows have found the island, but their swamp-weakened hooves have not. 22 of them pressed like at a cattle yard. One slips and can't make it back up the bank. I've got a good eye. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Our final reader is Melanie Cheng. Melanie is the author most recently of The Burrow. She is an award-winning author and doctor based in Melbourne, Australia. Her writing has been published in The Guardian, The Age, The Saturday Paper, and The Big Issue, among many others. Please welcome Melanie.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you to Get Lit. I'm calling in today from Naarm, Melbourne, from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And I'm reading from my latest book, The Burrow. They watched the rabbit with the collective intensity of a family watching a newborn, only instead of waiting for the flicker of a lip in a weak but thrilling imitation of a smile, they looked for hops and flops and a twisted acrobatic leap Lucy called a binky. They were the best kind of audience, primed and pleading for rapture, but by far the performance that delighted them the most was a grooming session during which the rabbit rubbed his cheeks with his paws and pulled his long ears around his face as if in parody of a human being brushing their hair. Indeed, the act charmed them all so much, Amy couldn't help but feel it had been choreographed for their pleasure. After a few days, however, the novelty wore off. And when Lucy and Jin returned to their YouTube videos and news feeds, Amy was left to tidy the hutch, a distasteful task which involved rolling up the urine-stained newspaper and retrieving stray pellets of poo, sometimes one at a time between thumb and index finger, as if, rather than removing excrement, she was salvaging lost beads from a precious necklace. On this particular morning, when Amy opened the hutch, the entire contents were soaked through. The small overhang from the shed had failed to shelter the cage from the overnight storm as she and Jin had hoped. Even the newspaper lining the area Lucy called the bedroom had disintegrated into a grey papier-mâché mush. The rabbit looked dishevelled, his fur flattened and dulled by the rain. As Amy watched him shiver before her, she felt a tug of pity as well as annoyance. She retreated to the house to find an old towel, and when she returned, to her surprise, the animal let her rub him dry. He didn't even put up a fight when she plucked him from the hutch and placed him in a furry ball on the grass at her feet. He stayed close, grooming himself as she laid down fresh newspaper and hay, and Amy felt a small bloom of satisfaction at this gesture of, if not outright affection, then quiet acceptance. Lucy found her just as Amy was closing the door to the hutch. Like Jin, her daughter had a knack for arriving at the exact instant the chore was being completed. Amy's eyes fell to Lucy's bare feet on the wet grass. She watched her toes sinking into the soft black soil and tried not to imagine her muddy footprints on the freshly mopped kitchen tiles. "Mom," she said, looking up with mischievous eyes, "did you know that rabbits eat their own poo?" Lately, Lucy had been feeding her and Jin these snippets of lagomorphic trivia. Jin was showing signs of impatience, but Amy had yet to grow tired of them. They have two types of poos, hard and soft. They eat the soft type and leave the hard ones to mark their territory. Amy raised her eyebrows. She was shocked, not by the rabbit's diet, but by the girl who stood before her. There was a sparkle in her dark eyes and a pinkness in her lightly freckled cheeks that Amy hadn't seen for a while. Even her hair, a brown, matted mess, appeared to float like something alive. "I think I've seen him do it. He eats them straight out of his butt." At this, Amy and Lucy turned their attention to the hutch. The rabbit stared at them, expressionless, as he champed on a long strand of hay. "You disgust me, Mr. Rabbit," Lucy said, feigning a scowl. "Isn't it about time we gave the guy a proper name?" Lucy drove her big toe even deeper into the earth. "We can't just keep calling him Mr. Rabbit for all eternity. Rabbits only live for 5 to 8 years. Amy sighed. "You know what I mean." As she watched her daughter pull her toe from the dirt and survey it, a grubby pink potato, she understood. How many times had Lucy heard her and Jin tell the story? Towards the end, which of course they had no idea was the end, it was almost a compulsion. Amy had written a terrible poem about it, even though, really, it was not such an extraordinary tale. But they liked how it made them feel, spontaneous, impulsive, free, like a completely different family. 2 clipped and perfect syllables shouted by a toddler at a sonographer across the cool, dark room. Ruby. Ruby. "How about Dad and I come up with some names, like a short list, and we can make a decision, all 3 of us?" Lucy shrugged, but Amy saw the relief in her daughter's face. They walked back to the house together, arm in arm, hopping over the stray bricks and abandoned gardening tools and giggling at the vulgar noises Amy's gumboots made as she pulled them from the wet earth. It was only later that morning, when Lucy had settled into homeschooling, that Amy reflected on what she'd done. Another parent, a better parent, would have coaxed the grief from the shadows. A better parent would have exposed it, but not Amy. Amy had done what she always did. She had allowed the sorrow to lurk in the wings, gathering strength, while she stood in the open, weakly gesturing at it. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. Now that we've heard a bit of each of your work, let's turn things back over to you for a conversation about your journeys to publication and lives as writers in Australia.
Thank you so much again for all of these beautiful readings. We would like to begin the section of our discussion by acknowledging that the land on which Get Lit is held is on the unceded territory of the Spokane people, and we are honoured and grateful to be speaking here on these traditional lands. I am speaking from Meanjin, Brisbane, on the lands of Turrbal and Yagara people, and I would like to say Galang Naru Windawu in Turrbal language and Garambabigi in Yagara language. And we would also like to acknowledge the First Nations people of the many Indigenous countries that we're dialing in from, and to pay our respects to the elders of these countries and their connection to land and ocean, river and community, and as well as First Nations people from across the continent and the islands of so-called Australia. This is a panel on creativity down under, and as I was saying before we started this event, it was almost easy to bring these incredible people together along with the Get Lit team, and I'm very happy that you all said yes. Now, one of the authors here, Sulari, I think I counted 15 books and then I recounted and I believe it's 16, and I was wondering how on earth you would choose your reading from all of this material, but I'm so glad that you chose The Mystery Writer, which is your latest, and it focuses particularly on a character who leaves Australia to start a new life and possibly death in the United States. Could you tell us what brought you to a story of an Australian character in the US? Where did Theo come from?
Pardon me. Theo, I suppose all my characters are a conglomeration of things I've observed and things I've felt and things I've experienced. I distance myself from saying that any of my characters are me, but they are little bits that I have picked up and squished together to make a new person. So why do I write Australians in America? Because I tend to now, my contemporary fiction I set in the US, and this book in particular, The Mystery Writer, is about conspiracy theories and where they come from and how they're related to fiction, and how they run away with themselves. And that was a story best set in America for a number of reasons. and that's not to offend anyone. It's just the size of America lets that momentum turn into a juggernaut in a way that it wouldn't do in Australia or a smaller country. Why I set this, why I have my central characters as Australian, is because I'm Australian. And whilst there's a lot of similarities between Americans and Australians, the differences are subtle and they're nuanced. And in some ways, it makes it harder to write from the perspective of Americans than it would be to write from the perspectives of Zambians or Germans, because culturally we're actually quite similar, but the differences are there. And so I'm kind of a lazy writer. It's easier for me to write from an Australian perspective because I'm Australian. So what I tend to do is I write Australian expatriates in Australia, and I've done that for 3 or 4 books now, and it's become my thing, and it stems from a deep laziness.
Yes, what a lazy writer producing 16 books that are translated into so more languages than I can name, and published very widely throughout the US, the UK, Australia and New Zealand. So Larry, get to work. What are you doing here? Now, on this global translation phenomenon of your work, I mean, when you read and when I read your latest book, I'm just on the edge of my seat. I am so gripped by this brilliant prose that just completely captures us. What do you think it is? Is it the particular sort of mystery genre that that is part of your success and the reason that your work is so embraced globally? Or what do you think it is about your books that translate, so to speak?
Look, I think, and it's not just me, I think there is a tradition with Australian crime writers. It's suddenly gone dark on me. Sorry, that's just a cloud going over the sun. There is a tradition with Australian crime writers that we're not actually writing about murder. As much as murder and crime is a vehicle for our novels, we're often speaking about something else. And that's certainly true of my novels. It's, you know, the murder is almost incidental. It gives me a reason to gather people in the same room doing the same thing, which is trying to figure out who made the dead person dead. But essentially in each book, I'm having a conversation with readers about a contemporary issue that is relevant to everybody. So in The Mystery Writer, I was talking about, you know, the relationship between writers and society, the relationship between fiction and society, and conspiracy theories and how that all evolves. And it really is a conversation. I don't write polemics. I don't have the answer. I write about things that elicit my curiosity, as opposed to make me feel like I know. And I hope that what my books do is open discussions with readers in amongst themselves and with me. So that's as much as I can figure out. But of course, none of us know what makes a book successful. Otherwise, we'd all be writing bestsellers every day. And we just put our heart and our soul and our mind and our passion into our work, and we hope that it hits a chord.
Your work certainly does. Thank you so much, Sulari. This April is the first time that I've had the chance to speak at a festival in the US, and this is through this panel, but also I will have been appearing in person at Get Lit in Spokane, and it's such a privilege to be at that festival. And it's always thrilling to present to new audiences. I'm always interested in the fact that I write a lot about animals, and my novel about a dingo, or a story about the first person perspective of a kangaroo might resonate fairly naturally with people living in Australia. But I always wonder, how does a North American audience feel about this work? I guess that's a question to myself that I'll ponder. But I wanted to talk to Kyra, because you've just brought out your debut novel, The Story Thief, and that's been making waves in Australia. And am I right in thinking that this is also your first US appearance?
Yes, actually, yes. So Kira is how to pronounce my name, but yes. No, that's totally fine. I've had that my entire life. So yeah, so The Story Thief, it is my debut novel, and this is my debut US appearance. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity. The novel is not available as an actual hard copy in the US, but people can buy it as an ebook or audiobook. So that's for that. But yes.
Very exciting. And Kira, can you talk a bit about your journey to the publication of this story? Because it offers such a new take on a very distinct time in Australian literary history.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Yes, it's an interesting thing because, as I mentioned before, Henry Lawson is probably known as Australia's, best known storyteller and poet, who was writing in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And it's interesting because I think perhaps the image that a lot of the rest of the world has of Australia is of a place rooted in the bush, and bush heroes and bush gangsters behind us and so on. And a lot of that identity has actually come from writers like Henry Lawson, who were writing at that time, because when Australia, I'm talking about settler times, obviously. So in 1900 was the year that all of the states, or the colonies as they then were, of Australia came together to form the national family, or the Federation of Australia. And Henry Lawson's writing was very much at the forefront of that. And it was kind of positing this view of Australians as being rooted in the bush. bush, which is quite ironic because, in fact, most settler Australians have actually lived in the cities and particularly in the coastal fringes. But it's an identity that we inherited and we still have to this day. So I was interested, it was actually during my mature age university studies that I first came across Henry Lawson's story, The Drover's Wife, and also some of its best known retellings. And that's an interesting thing in itself, because in the same way that you can take, say, a Shakespearean play and retell it from another character's perspective or transplant it to a different time or place, the same thing has happened with Lawson's story, The Drover's Wife, and there's a 50-year-long tradition of Drover's Wife retelling. So, you know, my book is the latest and the longest of these retellings. And what bothered me about Lawson's story, if you like, is that it's a quintessential story about an Australian bush heroine. She is the drover's wife. She is painted as the hero or the heroine, and yet she remains unnamed in the story, as do her two daughters, whereas her two sons, Jackie and Tommy, are given their names in the story. And to make matters worse, even the family dog is explicitly named. So it does beg for a feminist retelling, and that's what I've done. And instead of taking the perspective of the drover's wife, I've taken the perspective of the little baby girl who's resting on the mother's left hip in Lawson's story, and I've called her Lillian. And so she believes that Henry Lawson has basically taken her family story, that it's based on her family and that her mother was the original but unnamed and unacknowledged drover's wife, which sets her on a path to search for the truth and reclaim the family story. And so all of that gave me the catalyst to present, I guess, a fictional page-turning story about one woman's life through the first half of the 20th century, but also to tell the story of Australia's coming of age in art and in literature and as a former British colony. So it's kind of two novels in one, which was ambitious for a debut writer. So it was a long journey, Laura. That's all I can say. It was a 10-year-long journey, and I got there in the end.
Kira, I wanted to ask you about this journey. I am also someone who takes around a decade to write a book, and I can see why it might have needed to take this long. The story is so rich, and you draw from so much, and yet bring your feminist take to this work. How have you found the road to publication, particularly in an Australian context? We are, I think, quite unusual in Australia in that we don't need to have agents. Many of us do have agents, but we are able to access publishers in Australia, and there are some great independent publishers. Well, there have been until recently, but can go into that another time. And so, Kira, how did you get to the point of publishing your first novel?
Okay. Well, I would say for me, the hardest part was definitely the writing and the research. And then I was actually quite fortunate in terms of finding a publisher. I didn't go down the agent path. As you said, things are still quite sort of open and egalitarian here, and we have free access to publishers. I think I did the hard work actually at the beginning in choosing to write a retelling of a famous Australian story. I put my business hat on at the time, and I thought, well, if I can pull it off, I've got a good chance of getting published. And that actually is exactly what happened. So I only, in the end, pitched to two publishers through the Australian Society of Authors, those 3-minute speed pitches, literally like this, on Zoom, 3 minutes, go. And two of them were interested and said, send me sample chapters. One of them ended up saying it was a little bit too literary for them. And then the other one went for it. And then, ironically, they probably took it in a more commercial decision than I might have envisaged to begin with anyway. But yeah, so I found my way to a great Australian independent publisher called Affirm. And then the real roller coaster began, actually. It's hard work, that stuff. So.
Can you briefly describe that roller coaster?
Well, it was, I suppose, after 10 years of kind of doing it my own way, it was really confronting, I suppose, to then be tasked with how to edit it ready for publication. And the terrible thing in my case is because it's a family saga that I've written, and spans, more than 50 years of Australian history. I had actually written 2 massive tomes worth, really. I'd written 200,000 words, which no publisher wants to hear. And in fact, they didn't even want to read all of that. So they just sort of said to me on day one, having read they'd only read the first 50 pages virtually, but they basically said, well, I'd like you to take that 200,000 words and turn it into a 100,000 word novel. And I was like, well, I really envisaged 2, and in fact, there could even be a 3rd. And they said, yes, enough of that for now. For now, just concentrate on making the first one successful. So put all the best bits into that. So that was like turning myself inside out. So I think I got my 200,000 words, and over about 3 or 4 months, I got it. I put 40,000 away for a rainy day, so that's still there. And then I took 160 down to 130, and then I threw up my hands in despair and said, I can't do any more, please help me. And then they took my 130, turned it into something like 105 by ripping out lots of it. But then they also asked me to write new material, which all of you very much more experienced authors than I would understand that in the structural edit, anything can happen. You can be asked to write new material, you can be asked to remove things, reorder things. And so over those next 3 months or so, I then had to suddenly write quickly and to a deadline. And I was doing 16 hours days at the desk, and my back was breaking. And also just the pressure of writing that fast. It was hard. And I still sometimes have second guess, could I have done it better? Could it have been taken into a different direction? But that's the thing. Once you're published, it's out there, and there's no doing it over again. So I'm proud of what I've done, and I can only hope that it has been striking a chord with readers. So we must have done well as a team. So I'm grateful to the publisher for that.
That's the magical experience of the final product, is that the reader can't tell when you added that final line just before it went out the door. Thank you so much, Kira. It's so fascinating to hear about that writing process and the publishing process and what we reveal and what is kept back. And I think no other form of writing works with brevity as beautifully as poetry does. I always think that all prose writers should do a little course in poetry so that we can remind ourselves of the true nature of a sentence and how long you can spend on punctuation. Very long time. Anne-Marie, you know about this better than anybody in this group. And I want to talk in a moment about the very exciting forthcoming collection, Metal, in a moment. You know how excited I am about this book coming out. But first of all, could we just have a chat about your editing experience of Woven? And you bring the experience of working with, as you describe, an international Indigenous poetic community, including from nations in the US. And I'm particularly thinking of the beautiful collaboration between Joy Harjo and Ali Kobe Eckermann. I had the privilege of hearing them read from Woven at the Byron Bay Writers Festival. Could you talk a bit about how this project was conceived? How do you bring poets, First Nations poets from different parts of the world, to collaborate on a series of texts?
What a beautiful question. And I remember, was that the Byron where we bumped into each other?
Yes, we did.
Yes. That was such a special festival. Woven, the seed of Woven really came about at a Kai table. We were about to have Kai have dinner together. So in a former iteration, I was of myself. I was a co-director of the Queensland Poetry Festival, which meant that I had the privilege of bringing poets in, curating authors and writers and poets. And the moment of Woven was really birthed when Joy flew in from the US, and Ali had just finished a residency at Bundanon, and they were both completely exhausted and coming from very different spaces, but met in Meanjin at Brisbane at the Tibetan Kitchen restaurant, actually on Brunswick Street. And I was sitting in the middle of them, and Joy was here, Ali was here, and it was really about being at a table with two tall trees, two sisters, two wahine, two women who hold so much in, you know, they're our poetic elders. And in that moment, I don't know if anyone else in this Zoom room has been physically part of something that you just know is going to, it's the birthing of a moment, something bigger. And I didn't want to be the only person who had the privilege of experiencing that, that sisterhood. So really woven the idea of poets collaborating, that came about at that moment, that meal where Joy and Ali came together, and I was just listening and observing, and, you know, little things like Joy pulling out her special bag of salt that she carried around the world with her special, I think it was special Himalayan salt that she, you know, watching her delicately put that on her kai, on her food, and the way that she and Ali interacted with each other. It really, it just showed the potential for how poetry could be on the page, being in their presence.
I get a little teary when you talk about that moment. I think it's just so special, and your generosity of you and the other poets in sharing essentially that moment in Woven is so wonderful. And now you're sharing a more personal experience, perhaps, in Metal, which, by the way, would have to be one of the best titles I've ever come across. So we're talking about Metal, METTLE.
Yeah. I love that people assume METAL. I love that. I love that play of, what's she doing writing about AC/DC? You know? Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to this poetry collection on rock. And it's coming out this year, which is so exciting. Can you talk about writing whakapapa in Te Reo Māori genealogy in your poetry, and from your reading, how does the intimacy of family imbue this?
Amazing question, Laura. Can the question be the answer as well? That was such an elegant question. So I guess in terms of that, if people aren't familiar with that word whakapapa, the spelling is WHAKAPAPA. So it's pretty much what every Māori person holds closest to their heart. It's our genealogy. It's what connects us to our ancestors. It's our Māori lineage. It is what draws us back to every Māori person has a maunga, a mountain, an awa, and a river. So we belong to a place through our whakapapa, through our lineage. And that place is where our bones are, where our ancestors are. And the title of the collection, Metal, came about through a description I read of a word that was used to describe my great aunt, who's Dame Whina Cooper, who led the great the Māori Land March in 1955. And someone described her as having metal. So that description really is what I wanted to draw out within Metal. How has that resilience and that determination and that courage to continue despite, how has that been reflected in my own whānau, in my own family, and of course, and beyond First Nations peoples. And yeah, what was the second part of your most excellent question?
Well, I was noting, thank you so much. I've written down, I'm continuing despite. I think we need to all have that on.
Yeah.
I mean, that really speaks, that phrase really speaks to your reading, I think, this really intimate moment of going to visit family. Could you speak about how that might have influenced your poetry?
Yeah, those sometimes family, sometimes whānau aren't necessarily safe spaces. Sometimes they're I don't know if you can hear my dog drinking water, sorry. Sometimes they're very, they're known spaces, but they're also potentially unknown spaces. And as I said in my reading, it's dedicated to people who have siblings with mental illnesses, which my two brothers, unfortunately, he did pass away unexpectedly last year, Jerry. But going to visit my brothers is, it can draw fear and dread, and it can also open up the potential for such beauty and such when your brothers agree to do something that you've been hounding them to do for 20 years, it can be like such success. So that's what I really wanted to talk about. And entering their building, the six pack apartment block, going up the stairs, and the way that everything is so tightly locked. People with mental illnesses often are their best prisoners. They imprison themselves the best. Everything's locked up, closed, kept tight. And so I guess in those pieces, I really wanted to unpack, unravel, share those moments of what it's like to be both a carer and a sister of someone that both deeply loves their brothers, but was also, trepidatious about those visits. I'm knocking on the door, what's behind the door this time,
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. I love how we're talking about, the different influences that come to our writing and the often conflicted moments of inspiration, and sometimes not knowing that what is occurring in your life is what is going to later occur on the page. And of course, talking to you, Anne-Marie, reminds me of my time living in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and being in the COVID pandemic, and I kept saying I was trapped in paradise. I couldn't get back to my family, and I desperately wanted to. And I spent a lot of time thinking about cows, really, because I was in a town that was essentially in a cow paddock, and I would make my way to work on my bicycle, and I would pass through a series of cow lives. In the first paddock, there would be the pregnant cows, and then there would be the next paddock where the cows that had just had the babies would be calling out for the babies that had been taken away from them. And then later on, you'd see these babies grow up, and they'd be tromping along to the milking shed. And then in the final paddock, there was this creepy scene where there were these, I thought somebody had painted bullet holes on the side of cows, and I thought, what sort of messy situation is this, that someone's going to shoot cows? But actually they were portholes into the cows' insides, so that the cows could be experimented on and work could be done on them while the cows were still upright and eating. And I found this, so basically I realized that I could see a part of the cow that the cow would never see themselves. I was seeing their intimate secrets, and the secrets of this place. Obviously cows are all over the world, and we have these contentious relationships with them everywhere. But I think the secrets of the cow there in Aotearoa, where I was tau iwi, a foreigner living in that place, really, really struck me. And along with that was the fact that the beautiful river, the awa that I was living on, was polluted by the cow industry. So it was very multifaceted, and it really made me contemplate our relationships with animals, in Gunflower and in my novel, The Animals in That Country, and also the climate crisis. And thinking about those things, one of the people who is here who has influenced my thinking so much on this and has been so generous in the support of my work is James Bradley. And I really love, James, how your work is just so deeply grounded in place, and particularly the impact of humans on environments. And includes your forthcoming novel, Landfall, which I'm so excited about. That's coming out, well, any moment, actually. We're sort of on the precipice, aren't we, of, of Landfall. And I'm endlessly fascinated by how, as philosopher Donna Haraway says, you stay with the trouble in your adult fiction and your non-fiction. So talking about Deeper Water, your non-fiction work about the ocean, what was the driving force of this work? What brought you to spend so much time with water?
That's a great question. And I think the Haraway quote is a really important one. It's one of the things I've wanted to do in my fiction and I've wanted to do in my non-fiction is to kind of inhabit that space that we're in at the moment, that space of, you know, of people call it polycrisis, other people call it turbulence, you know, of this moment of kind of intersecting catastrophes, intersecting crises, and to not shy away from them, but also not to presume that they are already resolved, because I think that's one of the things that's really important. That's one of the things that both my fiction and Deep Water is trying to do, is to say it's not over yet. We're still in the middle of it. It's going to continue. We need to find ways to live in it, but also, you know, to kind of fight it, and forms of social organization and personal resilience, which will allow us to do that. But I guess Deep Water, so Deep Water is a kind of big book which is trying to talk about the ocean from a whole series of quite distinct kind of directions. You know, so I read from a chapter about swimming, there's another chapter about shipping, there's chapters about plastics, there's chapters about the deep, there's chapters about fish intelligence, so there's all kinds of things. And what I really wanted to do was to use the ocean as a kind of lens to think about some of those problems I was talking about before, to see what looking through the ocean tells us, you know, what it tells us about connectedness, what it tells us about history, what it tells us about the climate crisis, and what it tells us about how all of those things fit together and feed into each other. And I think really importantly, how it offers, I talked about resilience before, but how it offers ways of thinking which might help us navigate the future and what's coming.
And is there something about the particular situation of being an Australian author living in Australia that influences your work? You know, where Australia has the very dubious distinction of having the biggest extinction crisis in the world. You know, we are bushfire prone. We are increasingly flood prone. It is a delicate environment that colonists came to, and I think it's been noted that within a decade or two after colonists arrive, they completely altered this very delicate balance of Australia. So is there something about this land and ocean? Is this the reason that you write in this way?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, on the subject of extinction, one of the things I did last year, I wrote a piece. The Australian Museum has a thing they call the extinction cabinets, and they are a set of cabinets underneath the museum where they keep all of the specimens of various extinct animals, which are obviously incredibly precious because there aren't any more of them. And you go to these great big metal cabinets and they open them up, and there's all of these remains of like thylacines and rat kangaroos and, you know, the melamus that went extinct up in the Coral Sea a few years ago. And it's a completely overwhelming experience. I mean, just all, you know, once they get to about the 10th animal there that's disappeared in the last 200 odd years, it's really overwhelming. Yeah, I mean, and I think that, I mean, Deep Water is a funny book because it's both very large, but it's actually really personal, and it's very much about trying to speak from a place where you can feel what's going on. So the book begins in the pandemic, at the end of the bushfires in 2019 and 2020. My mum was dying. The pandemic was already beginning. You know, it's this kind of moment where you can see all of those crises beginning to intersect and overlay each other. And I guess what I wanted to do was to take that sense of living in a place which is, you know, one of the places already most affected by the climate crisis and by kind of the long process of kind of ecological devastation, and I guess think outwards from that.
These themes of the intimacies that that are affecting our broader work, and also how the broader environment affects our intimate lives, is something that I'm really loving coming through in this panel. Ashley Hay, you have also spent vast amounts of time thinking about the environment, and especially about the most iconic of features in the Australian landscape, the eucalyptus tree. And this is also a tree that is now an invasive species throughout California. There are massive, you know, traps of gum trees, especially in LA. And I wanted to discuss your reading from 100 Small Lessons too. But first, could you talk about how you came to write gum? What is the fascination with this tree?
Thank you, Laura, and thank you to Get Lit for being part of such a great group of writers and stories this morning. It's amazing. Gum, I wrote Gum a long time ago. It's got a weirdly long life. So it was published, first of all, back in 2002. And the genesis story that I tell about it, which is not true, but honestly, it's so long ago now, I'm not exactly sure what else was going on. I'd been living overseas for about 3 years, and I came back into Australia and landed at Sydney Airport and drove through Royal National Park to go home. And I just remember driving through that landscape. It's a beautiful landscape, lots of beautiful eucalypts and lots of beautiful other things, and thinking about the ways it was said it had been such an alien and unattractive landscape for the first invaders, the first colonists who'd come, you know, barely 200 years before that from the Northern Hemisphere to begin this project that is Australia. And I wanted to think about, it was obvious why it looked very different to them, but I wanted to think about how it looked different and why it looked so frightening and so other. And through that, I went into so many rabbit holes of people who'd engaged with these trees in so many different ways: explorers, botanists, scientists, painters, writers, cartoonists, all sorts of different people. And I realized as I sort of went along and the boxes of research got bigger, that I was essentially telling the history of post-settlement Australia through the people who'd been fascinated by these trees. And I'm not sure that that there is anyone who doesn't take notice of the eucalypts. I also loved that sense that, you know, just as the Northern Hemisphere invaded Australia and took it over, the eucalypts then invaded the world. It's not only Los Angeles and California where those things are a problem. They are problematic just about everywhere around the world now. But they're also this incredible touch point for Australians when they're traveling overseas. You see one and you feel a sort of visceral sense of connection. So just as James was talking about the invitation to use the ocean as a lens in deep water, eucalypts were the sort of lens for me. The book had another life. It was revised and updated in 2021, which allowed me to bring a lot more about climate change into the story. Back in 2001, when I was writing the first edition, I'm not sure as many of us were paying as much attention as we should have been. Yeah, I'm really grateful that it keeps going and growing, which is, again, like the trees themselves.
Your point about taking note is something that really strikes me. Getting to know you as a writer and in your work, it's your quiet observation of the world that seems to run through your nonfiction and your fiction, and we can see this in 100 Small Lessons, which opens with such a quiet observation on the ground of Elsie lying on the ground and noting everything around her. Do you think that, I'd like to know how your observation of your environment influences your fiction and your characterization? Do your characters share these observations?
Oh, Laura, that's a beautiful question. Yes, I think they do. I think so. I began my writing life as a journalist. I was not ever a particularly good one, but I just really wanted to do it because it allowed me to talk to people and it allowed me to pay attention to what was going on. And I think that's 35 years ago now. And so understanding more and more just how, not just how important it is to pay attention, but how much you can see when you begin to, and understanding the importance and the power between paying attention at the most micro scale all the way out to the most macro scale. I saw somewhere just in the last couple of weeks, I'm not going to remember whose quote this was, but this lovely point about the sort of next step on from paying attention, which is giving something your appreciation. So moving from attention to appreciation. And I really love that idea. More and more I understand that the stories I'm trying to tell, whether it's nonfiction like Gum, or whether it's an essay, or whether it's a novel, if I ever manage to finish another novel, I understand that they're love letters. It seems to me that one of the most important things we can talk about and do at the moment is the centrality of love. That's a really odd thing for a journalist and an editor to say, but I think it comes out of that kind of paying of attention. I do give that trait to all of my characters because I want to believe that every single body has that capacity in them. And, you know, thinking about what we're going to need to do and who we're going to need to be going forward. It's not that it's the answer. That would be really sweet, but a little bit hokey. But I really think it's going to be a very important ingredient while we work out where we are and how we can be here together.
Absolutely. I love that you talk about love letters. Increasingly, in my writing and discussions about writing, I'm moving from hope, even though I'm fairly cynical. I don't think I was ever a particularly hopeful person, but moving from hope to love. I feel that love contains the nuance and the vulnerability and the confusion and the hurt and the wonder that we probably need in this world that we face and in our observations. And
I was just going to say, I had the thinking about Annie talking about just the beauty of and the amazing opportunity of curating. I had an amazing opportunity to be the editor of a journal for 4 years, the editor of Griffith Review. And, you know, this is a journal that covers so many different topics. You're working with economists and scientists and politicians and lawyers and novelists and poets. And the thing that I understood going through the editions that we made, all the writers that I worked with, every single one of the stories that they were bringing and allowing me to work on with them, they were all doing it through as part of an act of love. You know, it was a passion for what they were working on. It was an understanding of the importance of what they were doing. That seemed fairly central, which again is probably not something the utopian legal scholars or the, you know, the conservationists might necessarily have thought about, but it struck me that that was something that united all those very different voices.
Thank you, Ash. And this love language and this intimacy really speaks so loudly in your work, Melanie. I read somewhere, and I'm paraphrasing terribly, but I read that your work takes on the most difficult of environments, that of the home. And you do this with such care. In your short story collection, Australia Day, and your novels, they deal with the intricacies of family life, but often in urban Australian settings. And thinking particularly of the borough, could you talk about the cities and the Melbourne COVID lockdown as a setting for this intimate story of the Lee family?
Yeah, sure. I think, you know, Kira was talking about the traditional Australian stories that we tend to export to the rest of the world, like Henry Lawson's The Drover's Wife, and even more, modern books, contemporary stories that are set, the crime noir, rural noir, and even, Tim Winton type surf books, which of course I love these books, but they tend to be the ones that take off and get published internationally. And that ends up portraying a certain version of Australia to the rest of the world, which for anyone who's traveled, you do encounter people that do, once you start getting into a conversation with them about Australia, they do seem quite puzzled at the discrepancy between what you're describing and what they've consumed. I actually did a medical elective in Charlottesville, Virginia, and just my name alone, Melanie Cheng, and I'm from Australia and I look a little bit Asian, was quite mind-blowing for some people I met over in the US, just because of they were expecting, I guess, a blonde surfer, or just because of the types of stories that we tell to the rest of the world. But of course, as has been pointed out today, most of us in Australia live on the coast in cities. And, I'm a self-taught writer, and like you, Laura, I made my start in short stories and in competitions, short story competitions. And so I would read the winners of a lot of these short story competitions and try to emulate their stories. But a lot of the time, the winners were stories about outback Australia, rural Australia, and they were beautiful. They were lovely descriptions of eucalyptus trees, and I just felt that I could not write those stories authentically. I grew up in Hong Kong. I moved to Australia to study medicine at university, and I'd lived most of my life in cities. And I just knew I couldn't compete in that arena. And so for me, a big moment, which I mentioned to you in our email discussion prior to this, for me was to see Christos Troikas' book, The Slap, get such recognition internationally, because for those of you that don't know, the Slap is a book set in suburban, urban Australia. It's very gritty. And it's very multicultural, which was another thing that I hadn't really seen in a lot of Australian fiction, especially not fiction that was widely read. And so that book came out around the 2008, I think, and that was around the time that I was starting to try my hand at writing, and in a way I felt liberated and thinking, well, I can write the Australia I know, I can write about the Melbourne I know, and people might actually want to read it, not just Australians, but maybe people around the world as well. And so that's been my choice to set most of my books in suburban, urban Melbourne. And I seem to like very small settings. So even within the suburban urban setting, I tend to have most of my drama unfold in a family home. I've certainly done that with the two novels I've written, Room for a Stranger and The Burrow. And I'm often asked about this, and I think it may have something to do with my other job of being a general practitioner, because in my working life, I just hear so many stories, most of which take place and unfold in the domestic setting. And so I feel like there's so much high drama that occurs in that setting that you don't necessarily need an exotic place to tell a great story. And there's advantages too to setting things in a family home, because it's a claustrophobic environment, it's a great pressure cooker. And maybe along Sulari's line of being a bit lazy, I mean, it also means that I don't need to do a great amount of research living in a family and seeing the kind of stories that unfold in a family home.
Thank you. When I first read read your book Room for a Stranger, I just felt such relief about this urban story that was being told about relationships between humans, but also in that novel and also in The Burrow, there is the relationship between humans and other animals. And I wanted to talk to you about that. Do your novels start with these animals? In Room for a Stranger, it was a parrot, and in The Burrow, it is a rabbit. Do the novels start with these animals, or do they just enter the story of their own volition?
Well, I think it's been different for the two books. Obviously, you, Laura, love writing animals, and so that there might be something innate in us and a magnetism towards that subject. But as I said, I grew up in Hong Kong in apartments. I never actually had a pet myself growing up, and I think perhaps they held an element of mystery for me. With Room for a Stranger, I didn't have an intention to write about an African grey parrot, which is the pet that features in that book. But when I was growing up, one of my best friends did have an African grey parrot, and I think I think it was buried somewhere deep inside me, a fascination or intrigue with that particular animal. With regards to The Burrow, it was quite different, actually. Early on, I had this desire to write about the rabbit, and that came from my own family taking in a pet rabbit during the series of prolonged lockdowns in Melbourne, as so many people did take in a pet during those bleak times, wanting something soft and furry and cute to alleviate some of their grief about what was happening. But I did have doubts about writing about a rabbit, and fortunately, around the time I was contemplating this book, I read Charlotte Wood's book on writing craft, The Luminous Solution, in which she talks about artist process and how they have a kind of heat seeking, an irrational, perhaps, magnetic pull towards a subject that they can't explain. And that was what it was for me to write about the rabbit, and kind of reading that in Charlotte's book gave me almost permission to go there. And so I decided I will just write towards this. I don't know where it's going to go or whether it's going to be any good. And then, of course, as I started writing, I saw the symbolism of the rabbit, and it allowed me to explore a book that was important for me during my childhood of Watership Down, and I was able to incorporate that. And rabbits being prey animals, it was such a great theme. Even as I took in this rabbit during the lockdowns and looking after it, I was learning so much about this hypervigilance of this animal, this unknowable quality of this animal, and it just enhanced so many of the themes that I wanted to explore with The Burrow, about this grieving family who were not speaking to each other and were having to interpret each other's behaviors and subtleties. So I think if I ever feel that kind of heat seeking again, I will just write towards it and not question it.
Thank you. And I think that really speaks to the work that we're all doing, as Sulari mentioned in the opening, about writing really to open doors, to ask questions and provoke questions in the reader that will maybe make them see the world in a different way, whether that be through the moment of connecting or disconnecting with family, whether that be the connections that we make in the literary community or in the communities that we have around us, or that the questions about the wider world and what is happening. We're all working in such a slow form. some of us slower than others, but I think this slow work is where the real depth comes from. And I'd like to thank you all for your generosity in speaking about your work today and in bringing this work to Get Lit Festival. As I've been talking to people about festivals in the US, whenever I mention Get Lit, people say, oh, that's the cool festival. So well done for for bringing Australia to the cool festival. And I'd like to thank the Get Lit team for having us with you today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Laura. Especially thanks to Laura, not only for doing such an expert job leading today's discussion and helping us get to know everyone with such wonderful questions. That was just so great to feel like we could hear from everyone in that way, but also for sending us a submission in the first place. This is how this all came to be. So we're very grateful. I am especially grateful. I've always wanted to present an event celebrating Australian authors. As I mentioned before we started recording, I actually lived in the Sydney suburbs for just a year, over 15 years ago now. And it was actually the first place that I ever read my poetry out loud to a crowd of people. So it's a really special moment for me to be here in this position, hosting all of you today. So thank you again for sharing your work and your stories with us. And thanks again to Laura for giving us this opportunity and for helping to bring together all of today's authors. We're also thrilled, Laura, that you're going to be presenting here in Spokane with us. So everyone at home, make sure to check out the full schedule so that you find Laura's in-person events so that you can meet her here in Spokane. And thanks also to Mackenzie, Get Lit's assistant coordinator, for all of their hard work today and behind the scenes leading up to today's event. To everyone watching at home, I hope that you'll join us for more festival events, both in person and here on Zoom. Please visit our website, getlitfestival.org, for a full schedule and more information about all of our authors, including today's talented Australian writers. Thanks again for joining us today, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.